So now I've got one MIDI track, basically triggering all of these different programs, and I've got, like, I can mix and match to my heart's content. How I think about programming drums, I kind of think about it in stages, right? When we're talking about drums in general, if we're tracking drums, what are the kind of the different elements that we have to kind of consider? And ultimately, how can we break this down into steps to make it like just tolerable and palatable? So we've got a couple different things. Obviously, we've got the sounds of the drums, right? Which I don't want to say are irrelevant right out of the gate, but it's like we can tweak the sound later. Ultimately, we've got the part, kick, snare, kick, snare, kick, snare, kick, snare. What's the drum pattern? And then we have all of the elements of the actual performance of the drum. So we've got velocities, we've got what mics are we using in terms of like the round robins and the velocity layers. I'm just gonna start kind of going through my process. If you're wondering why the heck I've got all of these tracks here, here's what I like to do. So I've got a bunch of different stuff triggering simultaneously, okay? So I've got my main kit, which is kind of the most realistic kit. And what I'll do is I'll go through here and kind of show you what they are. And this is on an instrument track. So, but what I do is I do one instrument track. Okay, instrument track is basically a MIDI track, but it also lets you load a plugin to get sounds. And so you've got your instrument inputs and outputs. That's your output. You've got your input. This is basically your MIDI in and out. So right now, if I go into record on eDrums 1, which is kind of my main drum programming, that is Superior Drummer, and that's going to be, and you can see this MIDI track is triggering a bunch of different stuff, but it's triggering Superior Drummer, as you can see right here. So what you're hearing is Superior Drummer. If you don't have this kit, it doesn't matter. Don't worry about it. Just pick something that sounds good to you. Pick something that gives you the options in the with all the overheads and the rooms and all that stuff that you want. Like, pick what you like. Don't just follow what I like. So in addition to triggering Superior Drummer, which is kind of like my realistic drums, I also trigger at the same time by holding Control and selecting the MIDI out on my instrument track. I can assign multiple outputs. So I'm triggering Superior Drummer, and when you hold Control before you click on this, you can also then send this MIDI to Savior, you can send this MIDI to Contact, you can send this MIDI to SSD, you can send this to battery. And so when I press a key on this instrument track, I'm going to mute Superior Drummer. Okay. That's Superior Drummer. That's Savior. I think that's Modern and Massive. That's Steven Slate. That's Battery. That's Battery triggering one of the Chris Baseford drum shot samples, right? And then that's Steven Slate triggering a drum soap kick. So from this one MIDI track, I'm triggering all of these programs at the same time. So now what I can do really quickly, I'm just going to program something here. Okay. So now I've got one MIDI track basically triggering all of these different programs, and I've got just like I can mix and match to my heart's content, okay? There is only one MIDI track, but having all of these other instruments set up ready to go on auxiliary returns, they don't need to be on their own MIDI track. If you want them to be, that's fine. The reason I don't put them on their own MIDI track, there's a couple different reasons. Number one, because I see people do this all the time. They'll have a separate instrument track for every one of these. The problem with that I have found, and this is real world experience, like you start working off of that and then you realize they edited the MIDI on one and didn't copy it over to the rest. And so you're trusting that whoever is programming this, if they're triggering 5 different drum kits, if they made any changes at all, that they actually dragged the MIDI down into the proper spots. So yes, absolutely, it eats up a lot of CPU having that instruments open. So if your computer can't take it, shut it down. Just pick a few, right? I mean, here, we'll just turn all of these off for now. Make them all inactive. It doesn't matter. Again, this is the way I do it. Don't just copy me. You have to take this workflow, pick what works for you and what doesn't work for you. If you have different plugins, swap them out. If you don't have a powerful enough system to run it all at the same time, fine. To be honest with you, there's a reason why I just brought in a 2-track stereo file with no drums instead of programming drums in the big multi-track session with all the guitars and the bass and all that stuff separated. One of the reasons why I'm not doing this in a big multi-track session is so that way I'm saving CPU more for the drum programs. You might not need 4 main kits, an extra kick, an extra snare, an extra set of toms, extra set of cymbals, and then 6 tracks for the ambient stuff. In your workflow, if you're like, I don't like that big, massive, like crazy, overblown like sound that Baseford does, like that guy doesn't know what he's doing. Pick 2 kits. Pick 1 kit. If you can get this all done in 1 kit, go for it. I like having 1 kit be realistic. We have an awesome recorded drum kit with all of the mics. There's going to be leakage. It's going to be real, right? You're not going to be able to solo the snare drum and there's no hi-hat in there. It's like I want 1 kit like that. But then I also want a couple samples that I have isolated. Those can be more realistic sounding samples, like not like super processed, right? Then I'm going to want like the super processed stuff. And then I'm going to want the ambient samples. I want all of this stuff when I'm mixing so I can basically have control. And if I want it realistic, I can turn off all the crazy hypey stuff. If I want it hyped, I can mix that in and even sometimes mute the realistic stuff. And I can go back and forth. I have all my options. So when I'm programming drums, I'm kind of driving the ship here. I can basically create the ideal scenario from the get-go, which is why I set it up this way.